Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
I first of all just wanted to say how thrilled we've been by the response to our mini-series, really a mini-series. There were only 2 episodes in it, one of them looking at how Harold Wilson resigned in 1976 and then the race to be his successor. If you've not yet listened to those, they're available wherever it is you get your podcasts from or ad-free on our Patreon. This is our midweek episode in which Richard and I discuss some things that have piqued our curiosity or caught our attention this past week. Richard, why don't you go first?
Well, my matter of interest this week was inspired by a offhand comment that was made by Tom McTague, the editor of the New Statesman, in the magazine the other week. And it was a reflection on a recent visit that Tom made to Downing Street, where he met with the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Tom has a great interest in political history. He's written a book very recently about the history of Britain's relationship with Europe called Between the Waves. And I think Tom was interested in unpacking Keir Starmer's sense of history. The too long didn't read version of this is it doesn't really sound like Keir Starmer has much of a sense of history. 2 points in evidence. The first is that Tom reflected on the fact that when Keir Starmer stood for leader of the Labour Party back in 2020, he was asked by the New Statesman who he considered to be his favourite Labour leader, or which Labour leader did he take most inspiration from. And Starmer at the time said Harold Wilson. There was much speculation as to why he had done that, but people thought that that made a good deal of sense. If Keir Starmer saw himself as someone on the sort of soft left of the party, the centre left of the party, as Harold Wilson himself would have been, but someone who brought a certain degree of political pluralism to his approach to leadership, as Harold Wilson did. And at that time, now we know much better, but at the time, Keir Starmer was assumed that he would be quite pluralist in his approach to leader. Remember, he was talking about how Jeremy Corbyn was his great friend when he stood for leader, and he was seen as someone who could work with people on the right of the party. Also, Harold Wilson was seen as someone who had a very keen sense of how to translate policy into good politics. And people thought that maybe Keir Starmer would be the same, as it's turned out quite the opposite. Well, the staggering thing that Tom revealed in his piece in the New Statesman, first of all, was that Keir Starmer almost acted like he had never said that he saw Harold Wilson as his political hero. When pressed on it and reminded of the New Statesman interview, it seems that Starmer said, well, I just needed to give a name that wasn't Atlee, and Wilson was effectively the first name that came to mind. An extraordinary kind of offhand dismissal of what he had previously said. Sadly, it fits a pattern where pretty much everything that Keir Starmer said when he stood for leader of the Labour Party has been viewed as disposable by Keir Starmer himself. But even perhaps, at least for me, more troubling was the second point that Tom mentioned in his editor's note in the New Statesman, which was, as they walked through 10 Downing Street, they walked up the famous staircase to the back of the building. This is the staircase that has this yellow wall, and on the wall are images of every Prime Minister. And as they went up this staircase, Tom McTague said to Starmer, do you ever linger at any of these portraits and reflect on the challenges or the triumphs that your predecessors encountered? And Starmer apparently just said to him bluntly, no. And some people say, well, who cares? Maybe, the Prime Minister's a busy man. He's got to go up and down that staircase quickly. He can't be standing there lingering, looking at pictures of other Prime Ministers. But I think it's actually quite troubling behavior, because I think it suggests not only a lack of historical curiosity, but actually a lack of a sense of the history of the office and the responsibility that that history bestows upon the occupant in the present moment. And I compare that with Jim Callaghan, who we talked about in our Sunday episode on the 1976 Labour leadership election. When Callaghan becomes Prime Minister, he does linger and look at those different portraits. And Callaghan later on reflected how on that first day as Prime Minister, he was thinking about all of the various predecessors in that office. He was thinking of Pitt the Younger, he was thinking of William Gladstone, he was thinking of David Lloyd George, he was thinking of Winston Churchill. And then he was thinking, and now I am the occupant of this office. The purpose of that was to remind himself of the gravity of the office that he held. And the fact that Starmer couldn't remember who his political hero was, the fact that he seemed almost dismissive of the idea that he would reflect on the previous occupants of the premiership. On the one hand, people might say that's quite trivial, but for me, I think it is actually a very disturbing development.
A few opening points I wanted to make. One of them is about Keir Starmer and this apparent soullessness of the man, which I don't want to seem too unkind when I say that, because I've always wondered, is this a bit performative? Is Keir Starmer such a focus grouped political leader that he doesn't want to say anything that he thinks might upset or alienate anybody else? Is that the reason why when he's asked his favourite book, he doesn't have one? When he's asked his favourite poem, he doesn't have one? When he's asked, does he dream? He doesn't dream, apparently. Now, all of these things to try and make him as bland as possible as a political leader, part of a conscious act to try and make him as inoffensive as possible, that just have this byproduct of making him as uninteresting as possible, with the sole exception that he talks about loving football and Arsenal. I've always wondered if that's performative, but then given that style of leadership, yes, has got him to the Premiership, but has actually got him to appallingly low personal ratings. And there is that slightly glib desire, I think, among some in Labour to just try and get him to be a bit more him, to get him to be a bit more human, a bit more normal, a bit more likeable, a bit more persuasive and compelling as a political leader. And yet, in spite of that, he just doesn't seem to be able to tap in to that part of his own character or personality. That's something that I do actually find really quite concerning. Not to say that everybody has to love history. Of course, Richard and I are somewhat biased on this question, and by virtue of the fact you're listening to us talk about this, I suspect that you, dear listener, are as well. But there is actually a general value in history. And the second point I wanted to make is that I think we have seen a general decline in historical literacy among the people of the United Kingdom in general. I certainly feel as if I'm a part of that in a sense. I don't feel as if the history I learned in school was particularly good or comprehensive. It's actually a bit of a cliche now to talk about the lack of good chronological narrative history being taught in schools about our own country. I think that is still something we're largely lacking. And I think that's a problem now, which is fed through into people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. But in particular, I think we have a problem with our political class being less historically literate, or it seems sometimes only remembering the history that they lived through themselves. And in advance of this podcast discussion, I picked out a couple of examples of people who are real exceptions to that, who I don't think this will ever get through to the Prime Minister, and I don't think he'd be inspired by it, even if it did, but who I think could be inspiring to a Keir Starmer. The first is John Buchan, who was ultimately Governor-General of Canada, is famous as the author of the 39 Steps, and is just generally a very interesting and remarkable figure in Scottish and British history. I was conscious when rereading recently his memoir of sorts called Memory Hold the Door, that he probably read more books by the time he was 18 than I fear I will ever read in my life. And that's damning on me and praising of Buchan for sure. But it's amazing how he talks about when he was a teenager and how his heroes and his view of the world was shaped so much by his historical reading. he talks about, I early discovered my heroes, Julius Caesar, St. Paul, Charlemagne, Henry of Navarre, Cromwell, of whom I acquired a surprisingly just appreciation, Montrose, Lincoln, Robert E. Lee. I disliked Brutus, Henry VIII, Napoleon, him intensely. Most of the 1688 Whigs, all four Georges, and the whole tribe of French revolutionaries, except Mirabeau. Now, that might be an eccentric list for which there are things to agree and disagree, but it's remarkable that he's looking back on his teenage years with such a rich understanding of history. An example of somebody who boosted their historical literacy rather later on is Alec Douglas Hume. Now, he became an MP in the 1930s, was parliamentary private secretary to Neville Chamberlain when he was prime minister, and was, for example, at Munich when Chamberlain was negotiating with Hitler. But at the beginning of the Second World War, Alec Douglas Hume was diagnosed with tuberculosis and spent years in a plaster cast recovering after gruesome and graphic surgery. And he used a lot of that time to read. And he wrote in his own memoir, which is called The Way the Wind Blows, I read the lives of all the famous politicians of the 19th century, Melbourne, Peel, Disraeli, Gladstone, and I found a study of their differing characters fascinating. In history, I returned always to Macaulay and Trevelyan. I read much of Walter Scott and all the novels of John Buchan. He then goes on to talk about the huge number of fiction books he read as well as non-fiction. Now, of course, in Douglas Hume's case, that all came during this time of convalescence after his diagnosis, and when he was not playing a particularly full and active role in politics. But actually being historically curious and historically literate doesn't only have to come at times like that. And so I wanted to share a little bit about Harold Macmillan and the way he, when he was even in a great office of state, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer during the Suez Crisis, actually found time to do a huge amount of reading, which I think was actually very good for his, not a phrase he would use, but certainly a phrase we'd use now, his mental health, and also his regulation of his character and his ability to relax and to then actually focus on the decisions he had to make in a more effective way. So whilst the Suez Crisis was unfolding, Macmillan started rereading George Eliot, and he jotted down in his diaries lots of thoughts on several of the different books, scenes from Clerical Life, Middlemarch, Adam Bede, which he then compares rather unfavourably to Heart of Midlothian, and he's making these comments and having these critical thoughts about literature whilst he's in the cabinet during Suez. This is in Alistair Horne's biography of Macmillan, the official biography in the first volume. Horne writes this, by the midpoint in the Suez Crisis, Macmillan had already finished the whole of George Eliot and moved on to Churchill's History of the English-speaking Peoples. Really most readable and dramatic, it gives the only intelligible account of the Wars of the Roses that I have ever read, is apparently what Macmillan said of it. He then went on to Villari's Life and Times of Savonarola, before reading his Life and Times of Machiavelli. And I think what that just really goes to show, maybe it goes to show nothing at all, some people will be thinking, but there is merit in just being intellectually curious, learning about history, engrossing yourself in things that aren't just necessarily about the job, and finding ways to get inspiration, context, maybe warnings from history, alongside being an active politician on the front line. I think historically we had a lot of great statesmen in this country who did that very well. I fear in number 10 we currently have one who doesn't.
Now, some people might push back and say, well, this is a highly elitist view of the premiership and the political leadership, and the people that you mentioned, John Buchan, Alec Douglas Hume, Harold Macmillan, were all very privileged people, and so they had the benefit of this exclusive and elite education. My response to that would be, though, that when you look at the Labour side and you look at Labour leaders who came from humble backgrounds, far more humble than Keir Starmer's background, in spite of what Keir Starmer says, many of these leaders were extremely well-read and historically curious. There is, and we'll have to maybe even do we might even have to do a little episode or something on this, Lee. There's a wonderful survey of what MPs were reading at the start of the 20th century, and you look at the favourite books of the first parliamentary Labour Party, which was elected in 1906. And almost all of these men are working class men from very humble backgrounds, limited education. In many cases, they wouldn't have had a formal education beyond the age of 10 or 11, but they're reading or have read some of these great works of literature that you mentioned, but also I think showed a great interest in history. I think Ramsay MacDonald, who, although became a much reviled figure in the Labour Party, is one of the most extraordinary leaders that Labour ever had. Of course, he was the first Labour Prime Minister. MacDonald himself came from a poor background. He was the illegitimate son of a farmhand and a maid in rural Scotland, had a limited formal education, but what he was an autodidact. He was a self-taught man. He read voraciously and as a result of that became a brilliant writer. Some of his writings on all kinds of matters, whether that's on socialism or on the countryside or on history, are beautifully, beautifully written and have very deep historical reference points. Bringing things up to our episode on Jim Callaghan again. Callaghan, as we talked about, also had a limited formal education, but he was a man who was very intellectually curious and very interested in history and in ideas. And when Callaghan was a front bench politician, including when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he would go up to Oxford and have one-on-one private tutorials with different leading academics at Oxford just to, in effect, stretch his intellectual horizons and, I suppose, to avail himself of a form of education that he wasn't able to have through normal means. And of course, this is not just about looking into the far depths of history. We've had very intellectually curious and historically well-read Labour leaders in more recent times. The most obvious, of course, is Gordon Brown, or should I say Dr. Gordon Brown, because Gordon Brown has a PhD in history. Brown was a historian of the Labour movement in Scotland and wrote a well-reviewed PhD thesis on Red Clydeside about the radical organisation of James Maxton, the Independent Labour Party, and the early pioneers of working class political organisation in Scotland in the late 19th and early 20th century. He literally wrote the book on the subject matter. So this is not just something about going right back into the depths of time when we're in a different age. I'm talking about the man who was Labour Prime Minister immediately before Keir Starmer was Labour Prime Minister. I just think that there's a world of difference between those two individuals.
Agree. Just a final few observations from me. I mean, you're right. Some people will think it elitist. I'm unambiguously elitist when it comes to the qualities that I wish to see in a prime minister. I mean, this is the person who was asked to have the most power anybody can have in our country. I think that is something where we should hold them to a high standard. Just on that elitism point as well, of course, books and knowledge are more accessible now than they've ever been in the past. Now, being willfully ignorant about, say, political history, if you are somebody like Keir Starmer, who has spent quite a long time aspiring quite clearly to be an MP, party leader, and prime minister, can only be willful ignorance because there is literally no other barrier to it. It could not be more accessible. And a final point that I just wanted to make is that if I could say something cheery about Kemi Badenoch, and my hope that she would be a political leader in a different mould to the one that Keir Starmer has proved himself to be, at least in this respect. Last year, it was reported that she was reading, and she was quite clearly happy for the press to know this, Patrick Cosgrave's book on Margaret Thatcher from 1978, which I think was a very interesting choice for her to be reading, partly because Margaret Thatcher was the first woman leader of the Conservative Party, obviously at its most cosmetic comparison, but also, and I actually think more tellingly, Margaret Thatcher was the last person who tried to get the Conservatives back into government after defeat in just one term. Of course, after 1997, it took defeat in 2001 and 2005 before the party eventually got back in. The turnaround under Margaret Thatcher was, if you glide over slightly, the twin elections of 1974, which I don't fundamentally think changed this point. It was a 5-year transition from defeat to getting back in. And of course, that is what Kemi Badenoch is trying to do as well. And so if she is being inspired by history to do that, I think that's all to the good.
You mentioned, Lee, Winston Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples, which Harold Macmillan read during the Suez Crisis. Well, at that time, so it comes out, the second volume comes out in 1956, the year of Suez. And at that time, Clement Attlee writes a review of the volume in the newspaper. And it's hilarious because it's classic Attlee style. He is being quite catty, but in a polite, brusque way, blink and you miss it sort of way. But the fact of the review demonstrates an interest, obviously, in history from Churchill. No surprise, Churchill is said to have proclaimed, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it," but also a historical understanding from Clement Attlee, which comes through. So in his review, Attlee writes, "The story of 2 centuries fills the 300 pages of this volume. One might therefore have hoped for a more comprehensive and balanced survey of the life of the British people, but one is disappointed. 10 pages suffice for a survey of world events, including the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and the discovery of the New World. Just about as much space as is devoted to King Henry VIII's matrimonial adventures. I had supposed that English literature was one of the glories of the English-speaking peoples, and that of the Elizabethan age was one of the links that binds us to the peoples of North America. But there is little reference to it here. The authorized version of the Bible is duly noticed, and Spenser's Faerie Queene is introduced apropos of Queen Elizabeth." And it sort of goes on in this style. And at the end, he says, "When we come to the Revolution of 1688, interest quickens for the Churchill family, which, already noticed in the person of the first Sir Winston, now reappears in the persons of Arabella and John, precluding the great events of the age of Anne, which John will dominate. This is as it should be, for this history is mainly important for the light which it throws on the author's reactions to the past. It might indeed be better called Things in History Which Have Interested Me by Winston Churchill."
A little catty, but I think it's fair to say that all history books are basically things in history that have interested me on the part of the author. And in fact, I think that is often what makes a very good history book. I mean, when I've praised in the past on this podcast some of Roy Jenkins' historical biographies, what I've largely had in mind is the fact that you feel like you can hear Jenkins' voice speaking to you. It doesn't just feel like any other biography. It feels like this is how Roy Jenkins has decided to tell the life of Gladstone or the life of Churchill. And I think they're all the better for it. But we can certainly say that in that review, you can hear the voice of Clement Attlee.
Absolutely. Lee, what is your matter of interest this week?
Well, I wanted to try and unpack this week some of the things that we can read into one of the great stories of the last week or so, which is the losing of Morgan McSweeney's mobile phone. And this, of course, has proved controversial because of the expectation that a lot of government communications will have taken place via this phone, and now they are lost. Zooming out to the big picture, I mean, what does this tell us really? Well, it tells us that government is quite obviously a part of the same trend that has been taking place in all workplaces and in all people's personal lives, for the most part, of rapidly accelerating means of communication. Of course, if you think back to some of the periods in history that Richard and I have made a study of, when you go to the Bodleian Library in Oxford or the National Archives in Kew, huge amounts of what was in the days of Atlee and Churchill, but also the decades subsequently, is done on paper, with secretaries typing out memos that have been drafted in long form or dictated in shorthand, then being passed back for marking up, then going to the person who's senior for sign-off, and then being passed on. Huge amounts of that now are done as a much more accelerated process through modern communications. Email, of course, WhatsApp, so many other different ways of communicating. And I wonder, really, whether or not something which could have made us a better, more efficiently governed country has in fact done so? Or is there a chance that this tremendous efficiency now in human communication has potentially made the way in which we govern this country worse than not just, say, when it was in the immediate post-war years, done without reference to much technology at all, but even, say, compared to the days of Tony Blair, who famously didn't have a computer or a mobile phone when he was Prime Minister. There's things he didn't seem to be that interested in. Slightly curious thing with Tony Blair, he seems to be a bit of a technophobe, in spite of the fact that, of course, so much of what his institute talks about, and he often speaks about as well, recently in the context of AI, is all about tech. But he himself does not seem to be a particularly pro-tech person in terms of his personal life. Why do I think this efficiency may not have made us better governed? Well, in one sense, just because efficiency in and of itself doesn't do you any good if you're not trying to be efficient towards a certain end or towards a certain idea of progress. Aimless efficiency is useless, basically. I mean, if, again, a much made criticism of this government under Keir Starmer, if it doesn't really have a clear sense of what it is it wants to do, if it gets blown around by headlines or backbench rebellions, if it doesn't have a sense of what the change that it slapped on the front of the manifesto in 2024 was really change about or for or towards, then you can be as efficient as you like in the administering of that change. But if you've got no idea what it is, and it's hardly any benefit at all. Secondly, even if you do have an idea of what it is that you want to do and where you want to get to, and let's take a more generous view of the government and assume and say that they do for now. Well, simply being more efficient doesn't necessarily mean that you get to that end point more effectively, because there is this sense, I wonder, in which the ability to do and say and communicate more actually slows down decision making and the means by which you're getting things done. Partly because there's so much more fluff and just unnecessary things going on as part of the governing process, but also because arguably the modern means of efficiency or modern means of communication allow you to do more than you once will have done. So it's obvious now, we see it all the time, that the government can barely do anything without doing mass consultations on it, trying to consult everybody who they possibly can. And of course, that's made possible because you can put the consultation online, you can email people who are registered to find out about these things. It's all seemingly done very rapidly. But what it contributes to is a style of governing which is not at all rapid. And there's obviously a bit of an irony or a bit of a paradox about that. And so, yes, this is really just me thinking out loud about whether or not we were, and again, critics of this podcast may say, gosh, they're just being needlessly sentimental and romantic about the past again. Probably guilty. But there is a part of me that wonders whether or not the rapid communications that we're able to have now, and that we assume Morgan McSweeney's mobile phone was the linchpin of in Keir Starmer's Downing Street, has not actually helped us be a better governed nation.
Yes, I think you raise a couple of interesting points there, Lee. So the first is about how, in a sense, white collar work has changed in the last 20 years as a result of first email and then WhatsApp, and how, in one sense, these tools ought to have made us more efficient and more productive. And yet, in some ways, feels like we are less efficient and less productive, but busier. And I think it's worth reflecting on those two particular forms of communication, the email and the WhatsApp. They both are written forms of communication, and they are both instant forms of communication. Before WhatsApp and email, white collar work, civil work of government and civil servants would have been done through either writing letters or the telephone, actually. And we've kind of forgotten about the telephone as a mode of communication. And so basically, if something was important, you would write it out and you would send it off, and it would be sent through either internal courier or in the Royal Mail. And that in itself would take at least a day to sort of cycle through. So that's obviously less instant than email. On the other hand, with the telephone, if something was really important, you just ring someone up and you'd get an answer straight away. And in that respect, the telephone is perhaps even more immediate than email or even WhatsApp. But of course, ringing someone is potentially a bit of an imposition. So I think there was a social constraint on ringing up someone unless it was really important. And therefore, I guess what I'm saying is that I think that previously there was, because of technological limitations, there was a greater filtration process before generating a communication than there is now. And that's why I think we found ourselves in a situation where it's easier to communicate. The ease of communication has contributed to a volume of communication that actually, in some respects, slows us down.
Yes, I mean, my thoughts on that in part, if I take the example that I opened with about going to the archives and seeing the paperwork of history, basically, from the center of government when you go to these places, and compare that to now or what future historians will see. In one sense, the present day is both more and less, because I think you're entirely right that certainly then there would have been a lot more probably face to face and telephone communications, which are just not captured at all unless there was a secretary on the line as well who was making notes for the official record. But most of the informal chat and dialogue will not have been recorded in any way at all, and that is just lost. Today, where a lot of that informal chat and dialogue would happen would be via WhatsApp or Signal or whatever it is that people choose to make. So it is a written record. So the potential to capture a lot of these things today is greater. The flip side, though, in the sense in which I think it's probably less, is that I think there are fewer things that are recorded in the formal official channels as they would have been in the past around government decision making, but have instead moved to these more informal but written means today. And it's very unlikely, I suspect, that all that much of it will be retained for the records. I mean, if we consider the Morgan McSweeney story, the appointment of Peter Mandelson and Peter Mandelson's conduct is, of course, subject to internal inquiries. There are related police inquiries going on at the moment. There is enormous media and political interest in the substance of these communications, and yet seemingly they're not available because the phone was stolen. If it's the case in a situation like that, that communications aren't available when there are these legal and political pressures to get it, then what is the likelihood that they would find themselves in the National Archives in many years to come? I actually suspect rather slim. I think a huge amount of government communication will be lost to history. But the caveat to that is that the exceptions will probably be richer than what we had in the past. So if we think of maybe quite a recent example that might demonstrate that, when Matt Hancock gave his WhatsApps over to somebody who was helping him with the writing of a book about the COVID pandemic, of course, the co-author or the ghostwriter or whoever best described published them all. And at that stage, there's a huge amount of communication that would never be known in the past, which is on the public record and is not going to be deleted. So these things do have swings and roundabouts in terms of how records have kept, and also, I suspect, in terms of efficiency as well. And the big umbrella point, I think, for me would always be that if people know where they want to go and know what they want to do and have a sense of what it is they're there to achieve, then whatever the means and the mechanisms are for doing so, they will find a way of doing it. And if they don't, then they will either be hamstrung by inefficient means of communication or hamstrung by extraordinarily efficient means of communication. It's really the quality of the leader and the leadership that would determine how good a government is.
Yeah, I agree that I think in the future, the level of detail in archives could be very uneven because there will be much that's lost, but there will be perhaps certain batches of digital archival material that is very, very detailed indeed, perhaps more so than letters. And so I think actually, possibly on balance, more is captured than used to be the case in terms of our communications, because so much of how we communicate together is through text form. Although I would note that, although I don't communicate with that many MPs, some of the MPs that I communicate with on WhatsApp have that disappearing WhatsApp message setting on their WhatsApp. So whenever I go back and look for the conversations I've had with them, I discover that they've all been automatically deleted, and that's not particularly important for me, for them, or for I would say future generations of historians to know what we were saying to each other. But it is perhaps different than when I go back into the archives and I think of communications that politicians that I've studied had with academics of their own day. Those were in the form of a letter, which eventually is put in an archive, and then I can read it in a way that some kind of future historian, again, I'm not saying that the conversations I had would be noteworthy, but those conversations that have been had on disappearing WhatsApps are lost for good.
Before we wrap up this episode, just to say that we have a couple of bonuses that are coming up on our Patreon. One of them is that we've previously discussed on the main podcast about why the Labour government decided not to take us into the European coal and steel community, or the Schuman Plan, and why they were so hesitant about that. Well, in our bonus, we'll be talking to Paul Goldsmith about why the Conservatives, when they came back in 1951, having criticised Attlee's reluctance to take part in the emerging trend of European integration, whilst they in fact did not take us in either.
And in another bonus episode, I'll be interviewing my co-host Lee about a recent political success that he has achieved. We had a by-election in our bit of Oxfordshire for a district council seat on the Vale of the White Horse District Council. In fact, it is the council ward which represents the White Horse, which is the Uffington White Horse. Lee is now the district councillor for that area. And in that by-election, I'm saying this because Lee won't toot his own horn here, Lee achieved really quite a dramatic swing to the Conservatives from the Liberal Democrats in that by-election. And so we will do a bonus episode in which I talk to Lee about his process of running for local office, and also ask him to reflect on this swing that he achieved from the Lib Dems to the Conservatives, which runs perhaps contrary to people's assumptions of where the Conservative Party is heading in Britain, but maybe tells us something about the fragility of Lib Dem support in rural England.
And I should just say, it won't just be a hyper-parochial discussion of one particular by-election. It ties into a theme that was recommended to us on the Patreon chat, where people can support the podcast and get in touch with us and make comments on the episodes, where somebody asked about the survival and revival of the Conservative Party and what that may look like. So this will be using one particular electoral contest to see what lessons could or could not be learned. Anyway, all those will be available in the weeks ahead. In the meantime, we'll be back on Sunday with our next deep dive into a topic in post-war British political history. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.